I remember as a little kid watching my dad prepare for our family road trips by sitting with an atlas and a pile of highway maps and charting the perfect route. Rabbi London, I'd imagine you and Danny did something similar when Yona and Leora were young.
Not to the degree of Mark Antman.
Perhaps not. Hi, Dad. And this was no easy task for Mark Antman, because the path had to be scenic, it had to pass through interesting little communities where we could stop and explore, and most importantly, it had to include a number of high-end snack spots. The way my dad planned these long drives was loving and intentional. He knew exactly where we were at all times and where we were headed, and it makes me a little sad to admit that I haven't carried this practice forward. I think that's probably the case for many in my generation. By the time we were driving, most cars were sporting big, bulky GPS systems on their dashboards, and shortly thereafter, our smartphones came with navigation built in. All of a sudden, the atlas and highway maps became redundant, outdated, even burdensome. Within seconds, the internet could generate a fast and satellite-approved trajectory to any destination. But despite the obvious convenience, this new technology has not been without consequence. Following an electronic map means that we might not know where we are at any given moment. We may find ourselves traveling through areas we did not intend, and depending on traffic and construction, it may actually turn out to be quite the circuitous route. As Jews, we know a thing or two about meandering. When our ancestors went forth from Egypt, they stood less than 300 miles from the Promised Land, a distance that, if traveled directly, would have taken them no more than a few weeks to complete on foot. Of course, we know it took them quite a bit longer than that. But our history of indirect voyaging goes back even further, almost 4,000 years, to Abraham and Sarah, who were approached by God and told, Lech lecha ma'artzecha umim moladatetecha umibeit avicha el haaretz asher arecha. Go forth from your land, your birthplace, your family home, to a land that I will show you. Abraham and Sarah had no way of knowing where this call would lead, nor could they imagine what challenges they might encounter on their way. But they maintained faith that their divine navigator would lead them on the right path. So they set out on the road anyway.
It's almost like they had the ultimate GPS, the God positioning satellite.
Something like that. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, calls this part of our collective journey, history, the journey, a voyage with God that would eventually change the world. Abraham and Sarah's readiness for this path is explained in several ways by the biblical commentators, but Rabbi Sachs finds one of these explanations more compelling than the rest. In a midrash, or rabbinic expansion on the text, the rabbis compare the moment when God tells Abraham to leave his house to a parable about a person who is traveling from place to place when they encounter a birah doleket, a palace in flames. They stop and ask, is it possible that this palace burns without someone to take care of it? Who is the manhig, the caretaker of this place? And at that very moment, someone pokes their head out of the window and responds, I am the Baal, the owner of this place. So too, the Midrash continues, Abraham looks out at a world on fire and wonders, is it possible that world burns without someone to take care of it? Who is the manhig, the caretaker for the world? And at that very moment, the Holy Blessed One responds, I am the Baal, the owner of this place. Sachs writes that Abraham's faith is born not in the answer, but in the question, not in harmony, but in dissonance. Asking who is the caretaker implies that someone must be responsible for putting out the fire. But the answer, I am the owner, complicates that truth. The owner, in fact, will not be dousing the flames. The responsibility, at least in part, falls to the one asking the question. Abraham asks God, what are you doing about the fact that the world is burning? And God responds, I'm just the owner. What are you doing about it?
This moment, Rabbi Sachs writes, constitutes a dialogue between earth and heaven that has no counterpart in any other faith, a partnership which has not ceased for 4,000 years. It began with the choosing of Abraham and Sarah, through whom we are descended, and continued with our exodus from Egypt and the covenantal relationship that is solidified with the gift of Torah at Mount Sinai. How the Jewish people relate to God through the covenant comprises the central themes of the book we are planning to read together this year as a community. Dum-da-da-dum. The Letter in the Scroll by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. After last year's successful reading of Sarah Hurwitz's book, Here All Along, many people in the congregation approached me and said, Rabbi, this was so great. Can we read another book this year? Rabbi Sachs was a chief rabbi of Britain and wrote this book, which started as a letter to his son and daughter-in-law, which he gifted to them on their wedding day. It builds on last year's book by probing the questions, what does it mean to be Jewish? And why should I remain Jewish? When we read the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the Torah says that God saved us from Egyptian bondage with an outstretched arm and with signs and wonders. Sure, Moses and Aaron were God's messengers, but it seems that God really does all the work. God brings 10 plagues, parts the sea, even provides manna for the Israelites as they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. The Haggadah on Passover even gives less time to Moses and Aaron, who aren't mentioned. It focuses exclusively on God's role in the redemption from Egyptian bondage. As we look at how the world is burning today, wars, gun violence, climate change, xenophobia, to name just as some of what plagues our world, we may ask ourselves, where is the God who redeemed us from Egyptian bondage? Where is God's outstretched arm? Where are the signs and wonders? Once we arrive at Mount Sinai and receive Torah, no longer can we look to God to be the sole player in the universe. God is now counting on us. The idea of covenant, of what we call in Hebrew brit, means that we make a mutual promise to work together to achieve what neither of us can do alone. Rabbi Sachs argues that emunah, which is sometimes translated as faith, is better understood as faithfulness. To have emunah, to be faithful, is not an internal or passive activity, but requires us to live in consonance with a covenant. The Torah is no mere document, but the marriage contract between heaven and a people, the terms of their relationship, their bond of trust. And like a healthy marriage, this covenant is upheld through love. We don't learn and live by Torah out of coercion, but because we believe that our doing so makes the world a more loving and compassionate place, and that our lives are enhanced by living in relationship with God. Our prayers teach us about how our mutual love with God is expressed. Right before we say Shema, we say, Ahava Rabbah, God, you love us with a great love. And how does God show God's love for us? By making us able, lilmod, lilmed, lishmor, v'la'asot, by making us able to learn and teach and to do and to uphold all that is in the Torah. Our ability to grow and to live by Torah. This is how God shows God's love for us. And then we declare God's oneness in Shema, and then we respond, Ve'ahavta. We love you, God, not just with our words, but by our deeds. When we lie down, when we rise up, in our home and on our way, these are all opportunities to live in a way that shows that we love God.
As Rabbi Sachs teaches, humanity and God are partners in the work of creation. Faith is the call to human responsibility. As Rabbi London just said, she is one to teach to her high school students. Judaism is a religion of deed, not creed. Don't tell me what you believe, show me your faith through your actions. Moreover, Judaism believes in monotheistic religious pluralism. There are actually two covenants that God has, one with all of humanity and one with the Jewish people. God has a covenant with all peoples through Noah and a particular one with us through Abraham and Sarah. God cares about all of humanity but calls the Jewish people to a particular way of being in the world. We learn that from Abraham that our relationship with God is active and dynamic. If we see something wrong, we need to speak up. We need to do something about it. When God proposes to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham questions God, saying, "Far be it from you, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice?" The point of Abraham's dialogue with God is to build, rescue, and heal. There is no answer to the question, why do the innocent suffer, at the level of thought. The only adequate answer is at the level of deed, in the long journey toward a world in which the innocent no longer suffer. The question of why can lead us down a rabbit hole, a more faithful response being, what can we do now? How can we be of service? What would bring healing or justice in this circumstance? At Mount Sinai, we went from being a people of fate, having a common past, to being a community of faith, an assembly of people who are linked by shared ideals. We are connected to one another not just because of our shared history, but because of our mutual vision for the future. As we say in the Aleinu prayer, Letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to repair the world and make it a place where God's sovereignty is evident to all, a world where, as Sachs puts it, social order is based on the absolute dignity of the individual as the image of God. Covenantal society is the attempt to put out the flames of oppression and servitude and to create a society of collective moral beauty and grace, one that honors the image of God in every person and thus becomes a home for the divine presence.
Please put it in there. There's so much that is thought-provoking in this book, and I'm really looking forward to the deep conversations that I know that we will have this year. There are, of course, flaws, which I think will also make for rich discussion. For example, Rabbi Sachs doesn't probe into the struggles that Israeli society faces. Sure, this book was published in 2000, years before the current crisis, but even then the state of Israel was grappling with the difficulties inherent in being a nation-state. Rabbi Sachs waxes poetic about the creation of the state of Israel after almost 2,000 years of exile. He sees Israel as an opportunity to create a covenantal society in our own land that is in genuine dialogue with humanity elsewhere, and he is in awe that he is alive to witness the rebirth of Israel. He includes historical facts about the struggles that the Jewish people have when we had sovereignty in the land in ancient days, but he doesn't address how these issues are playing out today. During ancient days, after the reigns of only 3 kings, after Saul and David and Solomon, the kingdom splits in 2. The northern kingdom then fell to the Assyrians, who captured it from the north, and 10 tribes were lost. And 100 years later, the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom of Judea, resulting in the destruction of the first temple. By the time the second temple was burned to the ground by the Romans in the year 70 CE, there were deep factions within the Jewish community. Even so, somehow we managed to adapt and change while living in the diaspora. Rabbi Sachs quotes an early 20th century scholar, Rabbi Moshe Avigdor Amiel, who points out that Jewry's weakness as a sovereign nation became its greatest strength in exile, because the Jews refused to bow down to the majority. As Rabbi Sachs concludes, if in Israel Jews were ungovernable, in the diaspora they were unconquerable. If this was the case in the ancient world, how can Israel be more governable in modern times? Rabbi Sachs has faith in the ingenuity of the Jewish people, but he doesn't confront the thorny issues that Israel faces. He doesn't give us guidance as to what Israel can learn from its history or how it should act today.
Sachs also writes about interfaith marriage in ways we as Reformed Jews might find offensive or contrary to our values. He correlates marrying outside of Judaism with the disappearance of Jewish identity and the assimilation by Jews into Western society. Of course, we know that the rates of interfaith marriage have risen dramatically in the last century, and this has had an impact on the ways in which Jews relate to faith and observance, but it is not the singular cause of Jewish secularization. In fact, according to a 2021 Pew Research Center study, 2/3 of intermarried couples are currently raising their children with some Jewish identity, and nearly half of adults under 50 with one Jewish parent identify as Jewish. The report did find that children of interfaith families are far less likely than those of unmarried Jewish couples to be raised with a Jewish religious identity. But this speaks much more to how exclusionary Jewish practices have existed in Jewish spaces historically than it does to the ways in which interfaith couples prioritize Jewish identity.
Max, we've discussed the major themes of the book and some of what we found challenging or lacking, but we have yet to discuss the title, A Letter in the Scroll. What does this refer to?
A good question. Always with the good questions, this one. There's a teaching by the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism, that the Jewish people are like a Torah scroll, a living Torah scroll. If one letter is missing or written incorrectly, the whole scroll is considered incomplete. So too is it with each Jewish person being crucial to the Jewish community. Each person's uniqueness and individual gifts are essential to the healthy functioning and well-being of the community and its mission. Letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to repair the world, making it a place where all can live with dignity and without suffering.
Remember the burning palace that Abraham stumbles upon and wonders who the owner is? God claims ownership but seems incapable of putting out the flames. Abraham is faced with a challenging dilemma. There's a palace, meaning that God exists, but it's also in flames, meaning that evil also is in the world. As Rabbi Sachs contends, Judaism begins not in wonder that the world is, but in protest that the world is not as it ought to be. Judaism begins not in wonder, but in protest. And Abraham understands that his task is making the world other than it is, but it's a heavy, even impossible burden to carry alone, so he becomes the progenitor of a people who will protest and work together. One person cannot possibly quench the fires that burn in our world, but a community committed to learning and growing together, supporting one another in challenging times, celebrating together at joyous occasions, and joining hands and hearts to confront prejudice, reduce suffering, and work for justice. These can restore the world.
So, what letter are you? Are you a kaf for koach, strength? Or are you a resh for rachamim, compassion? Maybe you're a gimel for gimilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. Each of us has our own unique gifts to offer that will strengthen the fabric of our community and help us accomplish our mission.
So Max, today I would like to propose that today Rosh Hashanah is brought to us by the letter Bet. When creating the world, which we celebrate today, right? Today is the anniversary of the creation of the world. God began the Torah with the letter Bet for Bereshit, which means in beginning. A Midrash explains that God chose Bet because it is the first letter of the word bracha, blessing. The world needs blessings in order to thrive. This is what Abraham learns the moment that God calls him to leave his native land, his birthplace, and his family's home. Abraham is told that the destination of his journey is Hayeh Bracha, to live a life of blessing. The place that God will lead him to is not a physical destination at all, but a way of being in the world.
You know, Rabbi Lennon, there's also another set of words that begin with the letter Bet that people might be familiar with. Beth Emet.
Ah.
Beth Emet, House of Truth. And Rabbi Sachs's book will give us an opportunity to delve deeply into the idea of what it means to be in a Beit Emet, a house of truth, what it means for us to be in a covenantal relationship with God, and how this can guide our lives and improve the world.
The old GPS devices used to say, recalculating, whenever one would make a wrong turn. Some of us heard it a lot. The High Holy Day season is our time to reevaluate our direction in life and realign ourselves to the ultimate GPS, the God positioning satellite. May this orientation lead us to live lives worthy of being called a blessing.